Right now, looking at our agenda, we have a speaker from ISOC Global. That is Mr. Steve Olshansky. Mr. Steve Olshansky is the Internet Technology Program Manager at Internet Society, based in Colorado, United States. Steve holds an MS in Telecommunications from the University of Colorado at Boulder and BA in Political Science from Colorado College. He is a member of ACM and senior member of IEEE. I hope we are all familiar with IEEE here, right?
My name is Steve Olshansky. Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate being with you here today. I show this cartoon. Some of you may have seen this in the past. I'll give you a minute to look at it if you haven't. It's humorous, but it's not humorous. It's really a picture of what the future looks like as it relates to security and privacy for the Internet of Things, unless we get this under control, because right now it's a very uncontrolled environment, and there's a lot of threats to our security and privacy. So I only use this cartoon as a semi-humorous illustration of where the world could go if we don't take affirmative action. So the Internet of Things represents both opportunities and threats. The opportunities are boundless as we get more and more connected devices. And I will note, by the way, that I do not call them smart devices, because in many ways they are not smart. And in many cases, the individual devices are only conduits for information back up to a cloud service. So we call them connected devices ordinarily. So there are great opportunities and there are significant threats posed to our security and privacy. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So I think you all are aware that we've seen an explosion of Internet of Things devices and systems. By many estimates, it's going to be several times the population of the globe very soon now. We're seeing these coming up around us in many parts of the globe. So as we see more devices connected around us, the privacy and security risks increase very significantly. And most significantly, many consumers of these devices don't even know about the privacy and security risks, or if they do know them, they're not sure of what they can do to protect themselves. So this is a big problem and only growing. So when we think about the threats to security posed by the Internet of Things, we tend to think of them in what we would term internal and external, or inward security and outward security. And what we mean by that is inward security. If you have a device in your home and some bad guy hacks it and uses it to start a fire in your home or hurt some property, then that's obviously a very significant issue and something that we would look at in terms of inward security. Being the Internet Society, we are also very focused on the external threats posed by compromised or hacked Internet of Things devices. And that is, you may have a smart device in your home that has been hacked and is being used as part of a botnet to attack critical internet infrastructure. And we've seen many examples of that in recent years. And in many cases, the person in the home may have no idea that their device has been compromised, because it might still be functioning perfectly normally as far as the person could see, and yet still being used to attack internet infrastructure. And the internet infrastructure might just be convenience items like online shopping, or it can be critical government infrastructure. It could bring down power systems, power grids, water systems, things like that are very important to government services, to the population, and pose a very significant threat. So we look at it from both perspectives, and it's important to keep this in mind going forward. So we've seen a lot of threats making the headlines. These are just some examples. And again, I don't want to focus on the particulars too much, and these slides will be available for you afterwards. But this is just an illustration of the kinds of threats we're seeing. They're making the news, and they are significant and only growing. So the Internet Society's perspective on IoT is several-fold. Certainly, we care about network resilience, trust, security, and privacy for pretty obvious reasons. I think everybody in this room understands that the internet has become central to the lives of much of the global population, and in many cases is used for core infrastructure supporting services and resource access that we rely upon for many aspects of our lives. The growing number of connected devices, many of which are unfortunately insecure and vulnerable, poses a significant threat to the internet and its users. So the consumer or buyer of these devices and the retailer or reseller awareness is really important, as is consumer education. We understand that market demand can be a very important lever when it comes to this kind of thing. And in fact, we are trying to make IoT security and privacy into what we would call competitive differentiators. And by that, I mean, if a manufacturer does well for security and privacy, they should proudly advertise that fact. And consumers should acknowledge that and make their buying choices accordingly. And say if a certain device that they're considering is known to have better security and privacy, that's an important aspect and something that should be taken into consideration when making a buying choice. So when we think about the risk spectrum, it can range from merely annoying and being just a minor inconvenience to significant physical hazard, both to property and most importantly to our safety, to our health and safety. So as you think about these things, the annoying things are simply that. They're annoying, they're a minor inconvenience. But since the threats can be so significant to our physical safety, this is something that we really need to take very seriously, especially as these devices proliferate and become very ubiquitous in our lives. So common mistakes that we see from IoT manufacturers are listed here. I won't read them to you, but the long and short of it is that many of these manufacturers are new to the connected device sort of arena. They may have been making refrigerators, for example, for many, many decades, but a connected refrigerator is a new thing for them. And I raise that because in many cases, these manufacturers, while they might make very fine refrigerators, are very new to the internet world and may not have the capabilities and the experience to understand what all the threats are and how they should be dealing with them. So as we move forward, a lot of what we're doing is outreach to manufacturers to help them understand. So privacy is a big deal, obviously. The security of our personal information is very important to us and our children, and is something that needs to be taken very seriously. It is as important as security. In many cases, privacy is either neglected or not taken as seriously because security is a more immediate threat, and that's not to minimize that. But it's very important that we consider privacy as well. And when we think about that, we think about what data is being collected, where it's going, how it's being used, and what control or understanding do we have over what data is flowing around us. So at the Internet Society, we're doing a lot of work on IoT security and privacy, and we have a broad term for this. We're calling it IoT Trust by Design. So we have 3 pillars in our work at the Internet Society in this area. The first is working with manufacturers and suppliers to adopt and implement the Online Trust Alliance IoT Trust Framework, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that shortly. Second is to mobilize consumers to drive demand, as I say, making it better security and privacy into competitive differentiators and raising consumer awareness. The third pillar is working with policymakers and regulators around the globe to push for better security and privacy in IoT to the extent that they're able to influence that through their policies and regulations. So as we work with the industry, we ask them to commit to the principles and the framework, and I'll show you that in a moment. And we try to push that all the way through the supply chain because we understand that many manufacturers do not make every particular component in the devices that they sell. In many cases, they acquire components from other sub-manufacturers and assemble them into their devices. So it's important that every step in the supply chain be looked at very critically in terms of security and privacy. And then the third bullet there is looking at retailers and asking them that they look very significantly at the products that they consider for sale in their stores, and hopefully only carry products that rise to a certain level in terms of security and privacy. So consumer organizations are a very important part of our work because they have the reach to the public to help them understand what the security and privacy aspects of these devices are. So we're encouraging them to utilize security and privacy aspects in their product reviews as available, and to help consumers make smart choices by providing outreach and education materials. Toward that end, in the first half of this year, we announced a partnership with an organization based in the UK called Consumers International. I'll talk more about them in a moment, but they're a member organization for consumer organizations around the world. And they're in more than 100 countries, and they have 200 plus members. So they're a very large organization with a great deal of global reach. So for policymakers, we encourage them to strengthen the accountability of every component of the supply chain, make everybody understand their responsibilities, and try to hold them accountable. We encourage them to promote the use of what we would call trustability signals, which in some cases may be a trust mark or a certification, or a way for people to understand the security and privacy aspects of devices that they are considering buying or using. And we encourage all the stakeholders to utilize trust by design, which includes security by design and privacy by design. And by that, we mean making sure that good security and privacy are incorporated in the design and manufacture and support of your products from the very moment that they are first conceived, all the way through their life cycle out in the field and in the hands of consumers. It's very important that security and privacy not be viewed as a last minute afterthought that can just be bolted on at the end before you take your products to market. It never works well. It needs to be part of the process from the very beginning. Regulators and policymakers in their roles can provide strong incentives for better practices in the world. That they have basically the ability to punish and to reward. And by providing incentives for better practices, that's a much more productive approach when it works. We also encourage them to foster technology and vendor-neutral solutions. We are concerned about the aspects of proprietary solutions for many reasons, not the least of which is something that we would call vendor lock-in, meaning that once you buy a product from a certain manufacturer, you're stuck using products that support that sort of infrastructure, and it makes it very difficult to either utilize other products or to take your data and move it to other products. So it's very important in our view that open standards and vendor-neutral solutions be a focus. And likewise, we encourage policymakers to make smart use of regulatory tools. In many cases, that means better enforcement of existing policies and regulations. There are certainly the ability to make new ones, but in many cases, the existing ones on the books, so to speak, can be very effective if only they were better enforced. So we have a number of resources that we use to encourage many of the stakeholders in the IoT ecosystem to better understand the issues. I've noted some of them here. I'll talk about the Online Trust Alliance for a moment. This was an existing organization that the Internet Society absorbed in April of 2017 and is now running as an initiative within the Internet Society. They are a very strong organization that is doing a lot of good work. One of the very interesting aspects of their work is the IoT Security and Privacy Trust Framework, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And we're utilizing this as the key foundation for much of our work in IoT within the Internet Society. So when we think about frameworks, there are a number of them out there, including ours, the OTA framework. And this is becoming a pretty significant resource for the world. And these frameworks provide guidance to the stakeholders in the IoT ecosystem to help them understand what the issues are and what they can do about them. So the framework, to be effective, needs to address all dimensions of the problem, all the way from the individual devices and sensors to the controlling apps, could be on your phone or on your computer, that control them, and the back-end cloud and web services. And we encourage them to focus on the full range of consumer concerns, including security, privacy, and the entire product lifecycle, meaning understanding and supporting all the issues for your device while it is being used out in the field. Realistically, we understand that manufacturers cannot support their products forever. There is a certain time frame. It may be 18 months, it may be 3 or 5 years, but at some point support for a product is going to end, and that's understandable. But these devices don't cease to exist at the end of the supported lifetime. In many cases, they may continue in use for years or even decades afterwards, unsupported, and in many cases unknown to the manufacturer. And as time goes on, this is going to become a more significant problem. So the Online Trust Alliance Security and Privacy Trust Framework is broken down into 4 key areas. I won't read them to you. You'll have these slides later and you're welcome to go look at them. But basically, they cover security principles, user access and credentials, privacy, disclosures, and transparency, which is very important, and notifications and related best practices. Here's a look at what the framework actually looks like. As I said, it's a list of 40 principles, many of which should not be shocking to manufacturers, but many manufacturers do not adhere to them, which is unfortunate, and it's for a variety of reasons, many of which relate to market pressures and economics, because manufacturers are under a great deal of pressure to get their products to market quickly and at the lowest cost possible. When you do security and privacy the right way, it slows things down and it costs money. So they need to be really incented to make this a part of their process and understand why it's important, even though it's going to raise the costs and slow down their product development life cycles. So toward this end, we understand that testing and certification and trust marks can be a very important part of this in terms of letting consumers and buyers understand the security and privacy aspects of devices that they are considering. So here are some examples of some in the world. These are growing very quickly. There are a number of these all over the world. They vary in terms of the depth of detail they go into. In many cases, they all have very similar principles in terms of what they're trying to cover. They may slice them and dice them, so to speak, in different ways, but many of them are looking at very similar aspects of the security and privacy landscape. Some of them are self-asserted, meaning that there is no independent testing, and it's up to the manufacturer on the honor system, so to speak, to say whether their products or services adhere to those principles. Now, certainly a manufacturer can lie about that. There's nothing immediately stopping them from doing that, but there are a lot of risks in doing that. One is the reputational risk. If it comes to light in the public that they have lied about these things, meaning somebody has suffered an injury, for example, and in the course of a court case where they're trying to sue the manufacturer, it becomes revealed that the manufacturer lied in their self-asserted trust mark about adhering to certain security and privacy principles. That would make things far worse for them. So there are reputational risks and there are legal liability risks in misrepresenting your adherence to these self-asserted trust marks. The full-blown certification is another issue. That's where you have an external auditor, an independent agency assessing whether your product and service adheres to certain assessment criteria. It costs a lot of money, it takes time, and it's a much more complex ecosystem. There are some of these out there, they are growing, and it's an important aspect of the world that needs to be kept in mind ongoing. But it is a much more difficult bar to clear, for example, for manufacturers, and it can be quite costly. And while a very large manufacturer may not find that to be a problem, small to mid-sized manufacturers might find the cost and time burden to be very significant and a real problem. So that's something to keep in mind as we talk about these things. So on the policy front, there are a lot of things going on. These are some examples of things going on in the US and Canada. There are similar things going on in various places around the world. Policymakers are taking notice. They're understanding that this is a significant issue. They're hearing from their constituents that this is something that they need to pay attention to. And a lot of these things, while they are specific to the individual country where they're happening, have content and principles that can be used elsewhere as models. So even though something may be based in the US, it still might be worth looking at as an example of something that could be built upon in other countries or regions. So in the effort to provide good, solid, factual information to policymakers and regulators, we have published several documents, one of which is IoT Security for Policymakers, which was published earlier this year. We have a companion piece in progress called IoT Privacy for Policymakers. And the link at the bottom of this slide is where you can find all of our privacy briefs. And if you're at all interested in the policy aspects of this, I encourage you to have a look at them and feel free to share any of these with anybody you think might be interested in a government role in particular. So taking a step up, we view this as a collective responsibility. There's no one player in this ecosystem who's solely responsible. The responsibility lies on all of us. So it's important to us as consumers to make our voices heard, to inform ourselves, and to try to better understand what the issues are, and to advocate for the people that we talk to about why these things are important. So when you think about privacy, data is a really critical aspect to this, in the sense that these devices are collecting a lot of information about us, in many cases much more than they actually need to provide the service or functionality that they were designed for, just because they can. If they're monitoring your house, they can collect a lot of information about your movements. And if somebody is looking to break into your house, knowing when you're there and when you're not can be very useful to know when to break in. So these kind of things can have really significant aspects on our security as well. It also expands the reach of surveillance and tracking, which can be a real significant problem in many parts of the world, in all parts of the world. So it really kind of reframes the debate about privacy issues, because it dramatically changes and increases the way that personal data is collected and used. This had significant implications on our basic rights and our sense of personal safety and control, and more fundamentally, our ability to trust the internet and the devices connected to it. So as we think about enhancing the privacy in IoT, we need to develop strategies that respect individual privacy choices and enable individuals to understand what data is being collected and transmitted and to control it. And traditional online privacy models may not fit when you have ubiquitous devices all around. Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Would you say again?
Yes, sorry, I think it was a mic issue over there. You can proceed.
Oh, okay. No worries. So I'm almost done here. And then I'm happy to take questions or comments. So as we think about enhancing privacy on IoT, it's really important that we think about individual privacy choices and ways for users to express them and understand what kind of information is being collected. Transparency and openness are key, and the ability to make meaningful choices is extremely important. Minimizing the data that's collected and the way it's used is a very important aspect of this, and it can be very challenging when you don't even know what's being collected. And as important as any of this is the ability to opt out and decide that I don't want to collect this information. If I have a smart refrigerator or a connected refrigerator, even I make that mistake. If I have a connected refrigerator in my home, it should still function as a refrigerator, even if it's not connected to the internet, or if the manufacturer goes out of business or stops supporting it. It should still keep my food cold. So it's really important that users have the ability to understand how these things work and to still use them for their primary function, even if they're not connected. So earlier I mentioned Consumers International, which is the global organization for consumer organizations. The link's in here. I'll let you have a look. I will note that there is a Botswana member. I couldn't find a website for them, but if you go to the Consumers International website and look at their members page, you'll see a little bit more information about them. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this organization, but they do have a member in Botswana. So we will be working with Consumers International on a number of initiatives. And our goal is to ensure that individuals have access to secure connected devices, that they understand what the online privacy and security aspects of these things mean for them. And most importantly, that they are empowered to make informed choices about the technology they use in their daily lives. So I think it's pretty clear to us that the IoT has tremendous potential to transform the way we interact with our environment and with the internet. But it's very important that we act soon and now to address the security and privacy challenges. As we become more enmeshed in this ubiquitous IoT environment, we need to understand what these issues are, what the benefits are, and what the risks are. The risks are significant and the challenges, but they are not insurmountable. And we shouldn't just throw up our hands and say this is a lost cause and there's nothing we can do. There's quite a lot that we can do even in our individual lives. It's important to understand that IoT systems are extremely complex and every part must be secured. These things are only as secure as the weakest link, and the weakest link can be very hard to discern when you're looking at very complex systems. And as I was saying earlier, the economics favor weak security. The market pressures toward cost reduction and speed to market work against better security and privacy. And these are constant challenges and they're not going away. So it's important that we try to encourage dialogue and engagement with all of the stakeholders that we have access to, and encourage collaboration to find solutions for these problems and figure out the best ways forward. We understand that consumer knowledge of IoT security and privacy is low, and thus awareness and education are extremely important, but they're challenging. We know that market demand can be a very important driver. For example, when governments procure products and services, when retailers make better security and privacy a requirement, these things can have a significant impact. We understand that security is difficult, especially for new players. We understand that security support is challenging and it must be maintained as long as possible. And we also acknowledge that there is an important role potentially for certification and trust marks, but this is a complex space. So if you're not aware or if you haven't seen, the Internet Society has a number of resources around the Internet of Things. Here's the link, just internetsociety.org/IoT. There are a lot of links off of there, including to the Online Trust Alliance resources. Here's some links that you can look at your leisure for more information. And most importantly, you should be empowered and feel like you can and should get involved. It's really important to make everybody around you aware of the need for better security and privacy in IoT. If and as you interact with any manufacturers or retailers, it's important to express your views and encourage them to use the IoT trust framework or similar frameworks as a filter and things that they should use as guidance to adopt when they're manufacturing their products. And educate your friends and family about the IoT security and privacy aspects, or what we would call hygiene. And most effectively, engage with your ISOC chapter. It's really important. You have a really unique resource here with the Internet Society chapter. and your ability to interact with the internet society globally. And we're very eager to support you in that. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steve.